Assalamu alaikum, this is Adya Malik, and today we are going to do a little summary of the Neoclassical Era. This is part of the ELL 302 course, Introduction to Literary Theory and Criticism. So if you look at the picture, you can see that it's a timeline of British literary history. You need to understand that this is not world literature history. This is more like focused on the English language or English literature history. So it starts with Old English. So the first topic that we did was Aristotle's Poetics. So that is way before this, almost like 2500 years ago. So it was before Christ, 4th century BC. So we did that. And then when we came to the Renaissance period, we did Philip Sidney from this age. He wrote his work in Apology to Poetry in 1595 after his death. So it was published. So we did it here. So that is Renaissance. Then came Shakespeare and Marlowe and other dramatists as well. And then came the Neoclassical period. Because the next topic that we are going to do is Romantic Age. We are going to do Wordsworth from this part of the bookshelf. So we need to understand what the neoclassical literature was about in the middle. So it started from 1600 and ended in 1785. And because what Romantics wrote was a direct reaction to what neoclassical literature was, we need to understand what neoclassical literature was and who were the neoclassical writers. So first of all, we are going to talk about what neoclassical era stands for. Understanding that neoclassical era helps us better understand its literature. This was a time of comfortableness in England. People would meet at coffee houses to chat about politics, among other topics, and sometimes drink a new warm beverage made of chocolate. So this was a time when people had discovered chocolate, and it had come from different islands that the England had colonized at that time, and they realized that you can have this drink made out of cocoa fruit. It was also the beginning of the British tradition of drinking afternoon tea, and it was the starting point of the middle class, and because of that, more people were literate. So there was a change in society. Now you had a new class emerge that was called the middle class. Earlier, you had the elites and you had the workers. You had the earls and you had the churls. The earls were the people who were the landlords. They were the people who had the money, and then they had people working on their lands as peasants who were very poor. But now, because of more business and different expeditions to different part of the world, people were getting into trade and they were getting richer. So there was this new middle class which wanted to study and they wanted to be literate. And when they became literate, they wanted to read different kinds of literature, different kind of books. So they were looking for something new to read, and that is why there was this demand for more and more written work for them. People were very interested in appearances, but not necessarily in being genuine. So you can say that this was the age of artificiality. Men and women, they were obsessed by how they looked. So a lot of detail was given to the dress, to the hair. Most of the women, they used to wear wigs also. Again, in one way, you can say that they are hiding their reality because the wigs, they don't show your real hair. And being clever and witty was in vogue. It was quite in fashion to talk in a very witty and clever manner, in a very verbose manner, in a very artificially decorated manner. So the words were really high sounding and they were quite verbose, and the vocabulary had to be really elaborate for somebody to be called a witty and clever person. Having good manners and doing it the right thing, particularly in public, was essential. So you can say this was the age of decorum, how to sit, how to stand, how to drink, how to introduce, how to behave in public. That was very, very essential. More essential than it should be. So it was more essential than being genuine. So you need to pretend all the time that you are a very classy sort of a person and you know how to behave in public. It was a time too of British political upheaval as 8 monarchs took the throne. So it was after Queen Elizabeth. Till Queen Elizabeth, the political scene was quite steady. She stayed there for almost a very long time. But after her, there was a political upheaval, and in a very short time, you had 8 different kings coming and taking the throne and, then replaced. So the question of what does neo stand for when we say neoclassical? So what does the neo stand for? The writers of the neoclassical period try to imitate the styles of Roman and Greeks. Thus, the combination of the term neo, which means new, and classical, as in the day of the Romans and Greek classics. So the classical stands for the classical literature. Classical literature, please remember, whenever we say the classics or the classical era, we tend to refer to the Roman and the Greek period. So whatever was produced in Roman and Greek period, whether it was in Roman language or in Greek language, it was being translated into English language, and there was a new interest into classics again. And because it was a new interest, the people started going back to the classics again. It was called the Neoclassical period. This was also the era of Enlightenment, which emphasized logic and reason. It was preceded by the Renaissance and followed by Romantic era. In fact, the Neoclassical period ended in 1798 when Wordsworth published the Romantic Lyrical Ballads. So, as I told you, that there's a 200-year gap between Sidney and Wordsworth, and this is where we are trying to bridge the gap. This was also called the era of Enlightenment because a lot of focus was on reasoning and logic. But then after some time, this emphasis became a little unbalanced. Too much focus was on reasoning and logic and very less on emotions and passion. So it was more like head over heart, logic over passion. So feelings were suppressed and logic was given more reason. And for some time it was good, but then afterwards it became a little boring and little lethargic as far as literature is concerned. Actually, as far as the periods are concerned, this whole 200 years that we are talking about can be broken down into three phases. The first is called the Restoration period. This is where, the Milton comes in. Then Augustan period, and then the Age of Johnson. So as far as literature is concerned, you need to remember these three periods fall into the Neoclassical era. It depends on the writers as well. Now, the writers, you need to know who were the famous names of this age. So you had Thomas Gray. Okay, so he was a poet and he had written extensively. Then you had Jonathan Swift. We all know Gulliver's Travel. He was the one who wrote it, and he wrote in a very satirical way, and he was the one who ridiculed morality and social values because he saw that people were being hypocrite. They were somebody else and they were trying to pretend to be someone else. Then there is obviously Milton. He's a restoration poet, and that is why you have his Paradise Lost coming at the very beginning of the Neoclassical era. Then you have Alexander Pope, again a poet, and his poetry is very significant because he is known for the witty couplets and so many other subjects that he introduced into poetry. But most of the time, it is the language that we ascribe to Pope because his language was really beautified and difficult at the same time. His mock epic, The Rape of the Lock, is very famous. And then we have Samuel Johnson. So he was known to be a literary dictator of his age. He was a very severe critic and he was very verbose and ponderous, which means that he had a very high sounding vocabulary and he wanted to sound as difficult as possible. So he used to write essays and he has written poetry as well, but he has written them in a style which is very difficult. So most of the time when you say neoclassical literature, usually Samuel Johnson comes to your mind because when it came to him, the Age of Johnson, it became really difficult to understand what the poet was trying to say. The themes were very difficult. They become divine and abstract and philosophical, and poetry became more like a mechanized tool in the hands of the poet rather than something which was very natural. So poetry became very artificial. Now, introducing the age, it is everything that is written between 1660 and 1798. So it is nestled between Renaissance and Romantic, as I told you earlier. Before Neoclassical, you had Renaissance. After Neoclassical, you had Romantic. So this was in the middle. This was the era of Enlightenment, its movement against too much use of individualism and imagination in literature. So it was against individuality. It was against the personal expression of emotions. So it suppressed that. It believed that there should not be too much individualism in literature and imagination has to be controlled. More logic and reason has to be focused. The violation of classical rules and regulations. So more focus was on the rules and regulation, how to write poetry, how the meter should work, what should be the structure of a sonnet. So very strictly they adhered to the structure and the rules and regulations of poetry rather than thinking about the true essence of poetry. Now, as far as the characteristics of the neoclassical literature is concerned, neoclassical literature was defined by common sense, order, accuracy, and structure. So it was all about having common sense, Nothing could be described just through the feelings of the heart. It had to be accepted by the mind as well. Order, accuracy, structure. So you can see even the words, they are not talking about passions and feelings and emotions and imagination. They are talking about common sense, order, accuracy, structure. Everything coming from the head and nothing coming from the heart. Their character also practice conservatism, self-control, and restraint. Even the characters that you study in neoclassical literature, whether they are the characters of the novel or the drama or poetry, they are shown to be very conservative, having a lot of self-control and restraint. So they did not let go, as word would say, that the poetry is a spontaneous overflow of powerful emotions. So that was not permissible. A large number of literary work came out during this period, which included parody, fables, melodrama, satire, letters, diaries, novels, and essays. So you can say that as far as genre is concerned, this age was quite rich, but as far as the quality is concerned, it was very dry and very logical and very practical for that aspect. And more focus was on accuracy, that the thing have to be very accurate in order, abiding by the law. Then obviously, influence of the classics. This is also a characteristic that the people who were writing in the neoclassical era, they were influenced by the classical literature. And as I told you earlier, whenever we say classical literature, we are saying Greek and Roman literature. So the writers look back to the ideals and art forms of the classical time. Political and social affairs too, they were guided by the wisdom of the past. So they started looking at the past and trying to solve the problem of the present by looking at the past. Aristotle became like a dictator, and the classical values were also emphasized. The neoclassics emphasized upon the classical values of objectivity, impersonality, rationality, decorum, balance, harmony, proportion, and moderation. So these were the values that they were trying to give through literature. So you can see there is no room for emotion, there's no room for subjectivity, there's no room for individual aspiration. You're talking about being objective, be as least like you as possible. Impersonality, the poet should not reflect in his work. Rationality, a lot of rational has to come in, logic has to come in, decorum, order has to taken care of. And then also balance and harmony and proportion and moderation. So a very strictly structured sort of a literary period this was. Uh, Again, neoclassical, as far as Aristotelian notion of probability and unities, the neoclassics might be thought of as heirs to Aristotelian notion of probability as well as unity of action and time. Aristotle was revived and his teachings were again put into use, but in a very different way. Maybe Aristotle did not mean his teachings to be taken as directives and dictations, but somehow in the neoclassical period, Aristotle was taken as a master, and everything was done according to whatever he said in his works. As far as the nature of literature is concerned, the neoclassical writers reaffirm literary composition as a rational, rule-bound process requiring a great deal of craft, labor, and study. So they changed poetry from something natural to something very rigorous and practiced, that it is a skill that you can acquire, and there is a lot of practice to be needed. And it became something very laborious, rule-bound, not natural anymore. Gave more importance to social needs as compared to individual needs. And again, poetry was taken as something which had a social responsibility attached to it. Then you need to see what the society needs and you need to write poetry according to that rather than, expressing yourself. They believe that men can find meaning in society, religion, natural order, and government and literature. So, rationality was very important. You need to find meaning in everything. Nothing without meaning can be accepted. Imitation and nature, two of the concepts central to neoclassical literature theory and practice were imitation and nature, which was intimately related. Imitation is the concept comes from the classic, the imitation of classical models, especially Homer and Virgil. So you can say that originality was not there. There was a lot of imitation work going on. They were trying to copy Homer and Virgil instead of trying their own talent and in their own way. Nature, the harmonious and hierarchical order of universe, including the various social political hierarchies within the orders. So even nature was not looked at something natural, something benevolent, something which is nurturing human beings, but it was taken as something that was hierarchical, and with something very harmonious and politically arranged. And lastly, nature was defined in a very different way. Nature had a deep moral significance, comprehending the modes of action that were permissible and excluding certain actions as unnatural. So clearly, the neoclassical vision of nature was very different from the meaning later given to it by the Romantics. Even nature was not considered to be something motherly and affectionate, but it was something that had to be adhered to in a very strict moral code. And everything was about morality, everything was about logic. It was thought that everything has a reason and that reason has to be explored, and nothing is without reason. So, reason was emphasized, emotions and feelings they were suppressed, and that is why there was a reaction at the end of these 200 years that made up the new classical literature, that the romantics stood up and they said that enough is enough and we want the emotions and expressions to be valued also. Poetry is not just about morality. Poetry is not just a teacher, but it is also an agent of delight. So where is the delight? Because in this process of rigidity and adhering to norm and adhering to rules and regulations of writing poetry, something that was suffering was the essence of poetry. The poets, they were creating something that was moralistically very high, linguistically very difficult, and as far as aesthetic is concerned, it was not attractive at all. Why? Because it was neglecting human emotions. It was head over heart. And then the romantics came and they said enough is enough, and now we want heart over head. We want emotions and feelings to be given more importance than reason and logic, because everything cannot be defined in terms of reason and logic. There are so many phenomena out there in the natural world that you cannot define with the help of reason and logic. For example, love, for example, affection. These cannot be defined because no reason actually explains them, that how this is work. This is not a chemical formula that you can explain to anyone. So that is where the romantics came, and we are going to start with Wordsworth and his lyrical ballads. That was the first rock that actually struck the door of the neoclassical literature. And he's called the father of romanticism because he was the founding father as far as the new type of poetry is concerned. And we are going to do preface to lyrical ballads, which is more like a literary theory. And Wordsworth is explaining why he wrote these kind of poems, because his poems were very different from the neoclassical literature that was being written in that time. So he had to come up with a new way of expressing his emotions, and that is why he was a little apprehensive that people are going to reject his work. So in order to explain it to the people, he wrote preface to lyrical ballad. These were like few pages that he attached before the poems, but later it developed into a critical work of its own. So we are going to do that in detail. So this was Neoclassical Era, and I hope that you understand it. If you have any question, you can ask me. Thank you.